Hello, everyone. I'm just admitting as many students as I can here, hoping that one of our TAs shows up. So just hold on for a moment for me. Hi, Ian. How you doing? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we're able to.
Okay. All right, guys. Ian, you're good with letting people in? Ian, can you hear me? No? Anybody else having trouble hearing me?
No, sir.
Huh, okay. 1 second. Great, thanks, Alberto.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right, guys, so Ian, just let people in as they come. Something's wrong with Ian's computer. All right. All right, guys, welcome to the week 2 review session. Hopefully everybody got something out of the first week's review session. Hopefully it helped you guys on your first chapter assignment. Similar to last week, we'll just go over the chapter, talk about some main points, talk about some important topics. And then at the end, I'll give you guys an idea of what you might need to focus on for the chapter assignment. Hopefully everybody is also keeping up with our source assignments. Keep in mind, if you guys have any questions about those, go ahead and shoot me an email. We can set up a meeting, or I can answer your questions over email, whatever works for you. All right, guys. So last week we talked about the Spanish and the French and the Dutch. We talked about some indigenous American cultures, some indigenous American empires. We talked about the Aztecs and the Incans and the Mayans. We talked about the Black legend and the sort of frontier of inclusion that the Spanish used Native Americans in their process of colonization, that they enslaved Native Americans. We talked about the first Native American and Spanish intermixing or intermarriage, how this set up sort of a caste system based on ethnicity, based on how much Spanish blood you had. So today we're going to talk about the next major empire to start colonizing the Western Hemisphere, and that is the English. This is particularly important for our class, as we're going to be focusing on North America, focusing on the United States after the Revolution. So we're going to talk about several different changes that happened in England and how that impacted their colonization efforts in the new world. All right, so your chapter starts off by talking about some English history. The English were really sort of a second-class empire, or really even a tertiary empire by the 16th century. We know that the Spanish are already significantly involved in extracting wealth and converting Native Americans to Catholicism throughout the 16th century. Remember, every century named is kind of one century ahead, right? We're in the 21st century now. These are the 2000s. So the 16th century is the 1500s, right? Just to make that clear for everyone. So then the book gets into some important developments in England, really starting with Henry VII and then his son, Henry VIII, which really brings about an important change in European power dynamics. And that's because Henry VIII removes England from the church, the Catholic Church. Basically, Henry VIII launches the Protestant Reformation because he asked the Pope to get an annulment from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which is the first of his 6 wives. So because of this, the Pope says no annulments and divorces are against the Catholic religion, won't grant him an annulment. Henry VIII is this very power-hungry sort of egotist who says, okay, we'll leave the church, the Catholic Church, and we'll start basically our own church, the Church of England, often referred to as the Anglican Church, and he puts himself at the head of the Anglican Church. This sparks some incredible internal divisions between Catholics and what are called now Protestants. We'll talk about the Protestant Reformation here in a second. But these Protestants are basically those that protest the power of the Catholic Church. That's where they get the term Protestant. It's first coined in 1524 to mean anybody who protests the power of the Pope and the power hierarchies of the Catholic Church. So the Protestant Reformation really begins with a man, with 2 men, really, John Calvin and Martin Luther. Martin Luther tacks on the 95 Theses to the door of a Catholic church, which basically calls out the Catholic Church with 95 complaints about the church. Most of these are tied to the power of the Pope, are tied to interpretations of the Bible, are tied to ideas like indulgences, these special privileges that were given to clergy or high-ranking members of the church, and basically stated that the Pope held too much power in society. It's also about different avenues to getting to heaven, this idea that that there was predestination. We'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the Puritans. So anybody who protested the Catholic Church was categorized as a Protestant. Now we have many different denominations of Protestantism, right? Baptists and Methodists and Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Mormons and et cetera, et cetera. This is where this all began as a different group that interpreted the Bible slightly different than the Catholics. So you really have these 3 great branches of the Christian religion, right? Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. So England's going through this split. Then Edward's half-sister Mary takes over. She actually does support the Catholic Church. They call her Bloody Mary. She begins to execute Protestants. Then after she dies, Queen Elizabeth takes over. She believes in Anglicanism, restores the Anglican Church, starts executing Catholic priests. Again, these small sort of religious or differences in religious interpretation lead to large-scale bloodshed and conflict. So Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth I, coming in 1558, is the first to pursue opportunities in the New World as a way to build the English empire. Remember, the English are sort of a second-rate, tertiary power in terms of geopolitical power dynamics or European power dynamics. And so she's the first to pursue setting up new settlements and pursue exploration as a economic venture to help the Empire of England. So we see the first, sorry about that. So the first few attempts to colonize are carried out or orchestrated by sort of high-ranking members of the English military who have very powerful families. Much of this is based on these sort of patronage networks, who supports the crown, these powerful families supporting the crown's agenda and endeavors. 2 men, Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, are granted the charters to try to establish the first English settlements. The first is in present-day or north of present-day Quebec in Canada. It was called Newfoundland in 1582. It was a series of small failed settlements that they kept trying to reinvigorate. Humphrey Gilbert represents the crown, represents Elizabeth. He was very famous for the battles in Ireland. It's really important to note that England is very much preoccupied with their battles in Ireland or trying to take over and conquer Ireland in the 16th century. That's why we see, or one of the reasons we see they get a very late start to colonizing the Western Hemisphere compared to the British, the French, the Dutch, or the Portuguese. So if you think about the British Isles now, England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, they're trying to conquer all of that that's off the western coast of Western Europe. And they will use several of the same tactics and several of the same sort of processes to conquer and colonize North America that they used against the Irish. Let me admit a few people here. I'm sorry, just a second. So we talked briefly about this idea of frontiers of inclusion and exclusion. Who can tell me what the Spanish practiced? Do they practice frontiers of inclusion or exclusion? Did they include Native Americans in their colonization process, or did they exclude Native Americans from their colonization process? Just unclick your mute and you can just answer to the class.
Inclusion.
Inclusion, very good, right? They enslaved Native Americans, they intermarried with Native Americans, they converted Native Americans to Catholicism. Well, the English, when they conquered the Irish, they excluded them. They sort of carried on these same practices to Native Americans. Very early English settlements in the Chesapeake and in Massachusetts did try to convert Native Americans to Protestantism. King James talks about propagating Protestantism in the New World, but it was really more about gaining land, taking over new territories, setting up permanent settlements so that they could alleviate these population problems in England. So they really excluded Native Americans from the process. All right, make sure you guys read about Roanoke. That's a real famous, sort of mysterious settlement that was set up by Sir Walter Raleigh that actually disappeared. It's a sort of a gray area of history that we don't know a ton about. We do know that the settlement was first established in 1585. They sent over mostly men to colonize this area, this island of Roanoke. It was abandoned the next year. A second group came in the summer of 56. This time they tried to bring over families so that they would be more likely to, procreate. They'd be more likely to have children and to establish a more permanent colony. But these small colonies, this is months away by ship crossing the Atlantic. So it's difficult for the crown to keep a close eye on these colonies. The next time that an expedition was sent to Roanoke in 1590, the colony had disappeared. So there's all sorts of conspiracy theories. What happened to the colony? Did they starve to death? Some people say they were so hungry they cannibalized each other. Many people believe, though, that they were abducted or adopted into an Algonquin, a Native American tribe or chiefdom, and began traveling with that Native American tribe, or maybe approached those Native Americans because of hardships and starvation. But again, it's not exactly known why. So make sure you guys know about Roanoke, spreading Protestantism. This subsection on the social crisis in England is going to be important. Remember, the Spanish were mainly trying to extract wealth and convert Native Americans. Those were their two primary motivations for colonization, whereas the English were trying to alleviate population problems going on in England. In the 16th century in England, it was very difficult for regular, these sort of yeomen or these lower class members of society to access upward social mobility. Land was very important. Land was very limited. If you think about England, it's a very small island off of the western coast of Europe. So this idea that land ownership was the basis of liberty was very important for the English. The English considered the only way you could be free was if you owned your own land, if you had economic freedom from somebody who owned the land that you were working. So this played a significant role in promoting colonization in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere. This idea that you could get your own piece of land, that you could achieve true liberty, true freedom, if you made it to the New World and established your own farm. So these land as a basis of liberty is going to have some far-reaching impacts on Native American relations, on English perceptions of freedom, and on how the English will eventually start to formulate their own colonial governments and how they will define liberty and freedom. So land as a basis for liberty is very important. Make note of that. All right, so another thing the Protestant Reformation really highlighted was this significant difference between, or this significant rivalry between England and Spain. This rivalry is really entrenched because of this dichotomy between Protestants and Catholics. We talked about how the Spanish went to the Pope for the Treaty of Tordesillas to split up South America between the Protestants and the Catholics. So these Catholic countries are very reliant on the Pope to be part of this process of spreading their empire to the Western Hemisphere. So this really sort of heightens this rivalry. Remember, the English are printing the Bartolomé de las Casas writings, the Black Legend. They're propagating this idea that the Spanish are this sort of tyrannical and empirical group that are trying to take over the world, or that are oppressing these people halfway across the world. So in 16th century England, they have a real social crisis where population explodes and the economy can't really keep up with these population increases. So you have a concentration of wealth, which creates a major income division between the poor and the rich. We often refer to this as a socioeconomic stratification of wealth, right? An income gap. And it's very difficult to access upward social mobility. So this has a significant impact on the way Englishmen view the New World. This New World is portrayed as a land of opportunity. We see some examples in your book here on page 54, this pamphlet promoting Virginia, immigration to Virginia in 1609, offering most excellent fruits and planting in Virginia. So it's presented as this sort of land of opportunity. And we see this, that it works. There's this huge immigration boom to the New World. Between 1607 and 1700, more than 500,000 people leave England. So in the 17th century, we see England participating in establishing these new colonies and sending 500,000 of their overpopulated people into these colonies. Well, who do you think they're going to send? Are they going to send the rich? Are they going to send the people who already own land in England? No, right? They're really promoting this to the working class, to the small farmers, to these individuals who had difficulty accessing this upward social mobility. Out of those 500,000 people, about 150,000 came to North America alone. So this is a very rapid population increase in a very small portion of North America, up and down the eastern seaboard. We talked about how Spain really wasn't interested in relieving population or establishing permanent settlements or establishing, quote unquote, a new Spain. So when we compare those two, across the 3 centuries of Spanish colonization, we only see about 750,000 Spanish immigrants. In one century, we see 500,000 leave England and 150,000 come to North America. Once New England is established and the Protestants and Puritans start pouring in, we see what we call the Great Migration. All right, this leads to inevitable, very rapid conflicts with Native Americans. The English immediately bump up against several Native American tribes. These tribes are often grouped together based on common languages. One of the most prominent was the Algonquin Native Americans. Your book talks about relations with Powhatan and Opekekano. These Algonquin Native Americans who are under different chiefdoms, different tribes that are led by different Native American leaders. So then we get into the first permanent English settlement in Jamestown. It talks about Jamestown settled in 1607. It's not proprietary. It is a joint stock colony, meaning that the charter was granted to a company, a joint stock venture. This idea of a joint stock venture is basically first perfected by the Dutch with the Dutch East India Company, but it basically means a bunch of rich people get together and put their money in to start a company. In this case, the company was the Virginia Company. And they think, well, they see the Spanish and the French and the Dutch. The French are making a lot of money off of their relations with Native Americans and their trade. The Spanish are making money off extracting precious metals and gold and silver, and also their agricultural endeavors in the South and in Mexico and in South America, or present-day Central America and Mexico. So the Virginia Company thinks they're going to go over and make money. This is an economic venture. The first year is very difficult, lack of food. They really run into a problem of having a difficult time getting their settlers, getting their members of the community to actually work for the community. In 1607, this is founded, or King James is the one that grants the charter to the Virginia Company. So they call it Jamestown. We're going to see that happen a lot, where they name towns or areas after leaders and kings in England. They're having a difficult time getting people to buy into this process. They're starting to get stories are starting to be told about how difficult these early settlements hardships are. And then they call in John Smith. John Smith is really made famous by fighting for Elizabeth. He comes in to sort of whip the colony into shape. Make sure you guys understand the headright system that he uses, basically this work for your food system. Make sure you understand how he sort of challenges the power dynamics within the Jamestown settlement. He leads them to establish their first elected assembly, which is actually the first elected assembly in all of colonial America, called the House of Burgesses in 1619. This is where they really start to work out what type of political systems they're going to use in colonial America. And then make sure you guys understand the uprising of 1622. The uprising of 1622 is important because it really changes power dynamics in New England. I'm sorry, in the Chesapeake, which is present-day Virginia. Make sure you guys check out the map on page 58. Make sure you guys understand who Powhatan is as the leader of these Algonquin Native Americans. You'll hear the story of Pocahontas, which is an interesting example of how historical narratives have been sort of taken and manipulated by popular culture to serve certain contemporary narratives, to serve certain stories that want to be painted by particular individuals. I mean, in this case, Walt Disney takes this idea of Pocahontas and completely fabricates this whole story around her as this savior of John Smith, et cetera, et cetera. We do know that John Smith was abducted by Opechancanough, who is one of Powhatan's descendants, or actually, I think it's his brother. A lot of people think that this was a ceremonial sort of display, but the story is she jumps in to save John Smith's life, who's going to be sacrificed after being abducted. So anyway, by 1622, these Native Americans are tired of the Spanish flooding over by the thousands, occupying more and more territory. The English use several different tactics to obtain territory. Often they will present treaties or sales or present to buy territory from Native Americans after military conflict. They'll often use hooven animals or their own farming and agricultural techniques to expand onto Native American territories and then claim that it was theirs because they've already settled it. But basically several different techniques used to obtain as much territory as possible, because that's really their main motivation. Because of this, they're almost immediately in conflict with Native Americans who consider this land tribal and sacred, etc. I encourage you all to look into the actual story of Pocahontas. It's a very interesting story. She is actually captured by the English after the whole John Smith episode. She's sort of forcefully converted to Christianity. They rename her Rebecca. She marries John Rolfe, who we'll talk about here in a minute. They take her on a tour of England to basically show, look at what we've done. We've civilized this savage woman and made her a Christian. It's a really sort of sad story of stripping her of her cultural identity, parading her around to sort of promote this agenda of English colonization. And then unfortunately, she dies on the journey back to America. All right, so the Indian Uprising of 1622, Opechancanough attacks the Jamestown settlement, kills a quarter of the settlers. The Virginia Company sees this and says, you know, we haven't found any gold in Virginia. We haven't found any precious metals. We aren't making any money out of this endeavor. So in 22, the Virginia Company decides to pull out of Virginia, and Virginia becomes a royal charter or a royal colony. So that's important. There's three different types of these English colonies. A royal colony is run by the crown. They appoint the governors, they appoint all elected officials. Well, not all, but they basically run the colony. A joint stock colony is run by a company, the Virginia Company, the London Company, etc. And the third is a proprietary colony, meaning one individual was given a charter to settle a particular area of North America. We'll talk about two of those a little later, the Maryland and Pennsylvania colonies. So royal, joint stock, and proprietary. All right, after the uprising of 1622, the crown brings in a man named John Rolfe, who has been in the British West Indies at the same time the British are trying to occupy islands in the Caribbean, where Rolfe has learned about a milder form of tobacco that's more pleasurable to smoke. So he brings these tobacco seeds and these cultivation techniques that he learned in the Caribbean and applies them to the Chesapeake in Virginia. They have very fertile ground, very favorable growing seasons for growing tobacco, and very quickly tobacco becomes the major cash crop of the Virginia colony, taking place extracting gold and mining activities that they hope to find precious metals. The crown realizes they can make money off of tobacco. So to give you an idea of how quickly this takes hold, and only 2 years later, by 1624, there's over 200,000 pounds grown per year. By the 1680s, we have 15 million pounds of tobacco grown a year in the Chesapeake. So this leads to some very interesting sort of power dynamics in Virginia, where you have a sort of a powerful elite, this land-owning elite that controls a lot of the land and the economy in Virginia. You have a major sort of stratification, just like we were seeing in England. So because of this, Virginia and Maryland in many ways are dominated by a very small aristocracy, a very small population that owns the majority of the land and commodities. So we have some population, we have some hindrances, some obstacles to population growth across or throughout the 17th century. One of those is the lack of eligible women. The English aren't sending families over. Women are less likely to immigrate to the New World. And so we have fewer and fewer eligible women to propagate and procreate and create more families in Virginia. In an odd sort of twist, an ironic almost sort of twist, to promote women traveling and immigrating to Virginia, the Virginia legislature actually extends significant rights to women that weren't experienced elsewhere in the world. Ideas like dower rights, that's an important point. Dower rights are the rights for women to obtain land when their husbands died. These are rights of a will. So it was a problem if a woman's husband died, they didn't know what to do with the territory. Because of these antiquated gender dynamics, it was unheard of to transfer property ownership to women. But these dower rights in the 17th century actually allowed women to obtain parts of their husband, their deceased husband's former land. I believe it was 1/3 of their property in the event that their husband died. All right, so make sure you guys understand the importance of tobacco, the sort of social makeup of Virginia. Make sure you read about Maryland, the Maryland experiment, as it's called. You'll read about how Maryland was seen as sort of a refuge for Catholics. It was a proprietary colony. The man who was given the charter, Calais Calvert, had this sort of patronage network in Charles I's inner circle. So he was given the territory to start the Maryland project. So Maryland was sort of seen as a Catholic refuge, but it was also very much dominated by this small aristocracy. The most important cash crop in Maryland, again, was tobacco. All right, then we get into New England. All right, this is where the influence of a group of Puritans, which is really two different groups of Puritans, is going to make a major impact on the settlement and formation of colonies north of Virginia. So it's important to understand the distinction between Pilgrims and Puritans. So Puritans are basically everybody who wants to purify the Church of England from within, who wants to change the Church of England, who believes the Church of England has retained too many of the practices of the Catholic Church. So remember, Calvin and Martin Luther thought that these hierarchies in the church were too important, thought that that you didn't get to heaven by becoming a clergy member and working your way up these power hierarchies. Well, the Church of England was very much the same way. The Anglican Church had a very strict sort of hierarchy of power within it as well. So Puritans hoped to purify this Church of England. They sought to establish their own religious sort of refuge in New England, where they could practice their religion as they saw fit. So it's really a man named John Calvin who was the major influencer in this Puritan revival. So it's often referred to as Calvinism. Pilgrims, on the other hand, wanted to separate from the Church of England. They're often referred to as separatists. And pilgrims believed that the Church of England was beyond saving, that it couldn't be saved, that it retained too much of the hierarchies of the Catholic Church, too much of the old practices. And so they wanted to separate themselves and practice their religion as they saw fit. Predetermination is a big part of this whole division. It's this idea that one's destiny to reach God was determined before their birth. So a lot of this, so then you have several different splits within these two denominations as well. You have Congregationalists, you have Separatist pilgrims, Calvinists, Puritans. These are all just slightly different interpretations of the Bible. How one can reach heaven, the role that these nations or these empires should play, or the Pope should play in one's own personal journey. So the pilgrims, separatists, a group of pilgrims and separatists at the beginning of the 17th century actually fled to the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, or Holland, this is the Dutch that were mentioned in the first chapter, were much more progressive when it came to religious dynamics. The separatists fled to the Netherlands in 1608 because they thought the Church of England was being too oppressive. So a group of families got together and fled to the Netherlands. Then in 1620, they thought their families were becoming too Dutch. They thought they were being too assimilated into Dutch culture. So they went back to England, chartered a ship called the Mayflower to set up their own religious refuge in what will become New England. They boarded the Mayflower along with other indentured servants, individuals looking for economic opportunity, sort of an eclectic group of people, and they sailed for the New World. They're aiming for Virginia, just north of Virginia. They miss by several hundred miles and end up landing in Plymouth. They established the Plymouth Colony. This is where you get another one of these historical myths of the first Thanksgiving, where a bunch of pilgrims sit down with Native Americans and have a nice meal and talk about how much they love each other. But we're going to see that conflict very quickly arises between these two groups as well. Plymouth serves as an autonomous colony until 1691, when they're absorbed into the larger Massachusetts Bay, or what will become the Massachusetts colony. All right, so the Massachusetts colony is established in 1629. They are founded by merchants. The Massachusetts colony is another joint stock colony that is meant to be an economic endeavor, meant to be a profitable endeavor. It's chartered in 1629 to the London merchants. Then we have the Great Migration from 29 to 42, where we have thousands of families immigrating into New England, into this Massachusetts colony, to practice their religion as they see fit. We're going to also see that they have this sort of strange devotion to their king at the same time. Y'all's source assignment this week is based on the Mayflower Compact. Keep in mind that they have to get the charter from the king to establish this colony to separate themselves from the Church of England. So it's this odd relationship of trying to use the crown to establish their own settlement where they can support a religion that would in turn separate them from the crown. So these Puritans are very prevalent in New England. We have the advent of Puritan culture and society really take hold in New England. This Puritan society has a lot of significant impact even on sort of modern Northeast New Englandish American culture. So let's go over some 17th, 18th century Puritan, well, 17th century, early 18th century Puritan practices. Most Puritans lived in clapboard homes, which were one-room homes built by clapboards with a thatch roof. There would be a canopy roof underneath, a canopy net hanging underneath the roof that was meant to catch rodents that would try to climb in the middle of the night. Sleep tight is a term that we get from the Puritans. It refers to children tightening the ropes on their parents' bed. This was a very hierarchical, a very sort of a stratified power dynamic within Puritan families. The Puritan husband or father was the only one that sat at the table, was often the only one that slept in a bed. It was common for Puritans to have several children to help with the farms, to help populate these settlements. And they would all sleep on the floor as the father, sometimes the mother, slept in bed. Alcohol was very prevalent. There's a great book called The Alcoholic Republic about how prevalent and important alcohol was during colonial American times. One reason was that water, purified water, safe drinking water was difficult to come by. Puritans often used lead cups and plates to drink and eat off of. So lead poisoning was also incredibly prevalent. This is actually where we get the term saved by the bell. So it's common practice to have a graveyard and a boneyard. They knew that they couldn't bury too many dead people in one particular area, that it was bad for the ground, that it would breed disease. This all comes out of the Middle Ages. But basically, they would bury someone, dig them up, throw their bones in the boneyard, and reuse these graves. Well, they were starting to see scratch marks on the insides of coffins because people would go comatose from lead poisoning, and then they would wake up a few days later still alive, and they were buried alive. So they started putting ropes attached to a bell in the graveyard, and if you woke up from lead poisoning, you'd ring the bell and they'd come up and dig you out. That's where we get the term saved by the bell. It was common practice to bathe twice a year, once in May and once in October. You used one tub outside, and the same water would be used for every member of the family. Of course, the mother or the father got to bathe first, then the mother, then the oldest, and so on. So if you were the seventh child, you got, 9 people's bathwater to take a bath in. So those are just some sort of Puritan cultural dynamics. Massachusetts was also very focused on education. The two most important things for Puritans were education and religion. And those sort of went hand in hand. They want everybody to be able to read so that they can read the Bible. The first university, what we now call a university, Harvard College, is established in Massachusetts in 1636. They elected their governors based on popular vote. This is some of the first tenets of American democracy. You're going to read about that in the Mayflower Compact, this idea of a civil body politic. Everybody write that down and look that up. Of course, they did give preference. The only people that could vote were landowning members of the church. You had to be church going, so there wasn't a real separation of church and state. Taxes often went to paying ministers' salaries. This was also a hierarchical society. We see that members of the church got better land, were better provided for, had more prominent positions in society. And then make sure you guys read about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, 2 people who challenged the authority of the church and were banished from the colony for it. There was actually 2 separate court systems in Puritan Massachusetts, a church court and a civil court, just to show you how they didn't adhere to a separation of church and state. So make sure you guys read about Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Hint, hint for the quiz. I'll let you guys read that on your own. The Pequot War is another important war that's about trying to seize Native American territories. Make sure you guys understand the Pequot War. And then the book goes back and talks about some changes in 17th century England that are going to affect how these colonies are governed and run. Um, the first major one that you need to read about is the English Civil War. We're into the Charles I reign at this point. Charles I has a conflict with Parliament, who is represented by Oliver Cromwell. This is very much about the power of the House of Commons, the power of Parliament over the power of the King. Oliver Cromwell, who's a Puritan, actually starts this grudge because Charles I is married to a Catholic woman. So read about the English Civil War in the 1640s. It is important to understand it, but what's most important is to understand how it impacts ideas of liberty and freedom in American colonists. So Oliver Cromwell is arguing that the people should have more of a say than the monarchy in how things are governed in England. He leads the parliamentary army, which basically overthrows Charles I. They chop off his head. Oliver Cromwell then oddly becomes a very oppressive dictator himself, rules for 11 years from 1650 to 1660. And although it brings up these issues of what a freeborn Englishman is and what it means to have liberty, he actually starts going around murdering Catholic priests and closing down theaters, and it establishes several of these very oppressive puritanical restrictions on England itself. He does, however, establish the first tax on colonial America because he wants to start making money off of English colonies across the world. So he establishes the Navigation Act, the first of several Navigation Acts, which basically forces colonies to use English ships to send English goods back to be sold in Europe. So this is very much about the Dutch East India Company coming to dominate the sea. Even though English colonies are growing tobacco and these other profitable exports, sugar in the Caribbean and so forth, eventually rice in the South, they often use Dutch vessels to ship those goods back to Europe to sell. So this circumvents the crown in gaining money off of these exports. So Cromwell wants the English to use English vessels to make sure that England is making the most they can off of these economic ventures. So make sure you guys understand Oliver Cromwell, the English Civil War. Make sure you guys understand New England economies. They're different from Virginia economies. In New England, we see a lot of subsistence farming. We see smaller family farms. The land in England isn't near as suitable for cultivation as it is in Virginia. Winters in New England are much harsher than they are in Virginia, so the growing season is much shorter. So rather than having one crop cultivated on a mass scale like tobacco is in Virginia, you have several subsistence farms that are sort of sustaining these smaller or sustaining these New England settlements, and they're not really shipping near as many agricultural products. They do have an industry in building in lumber and shipbuilding because of the trees in New England. And we see this interesting relationship between Puritans and profit. Puritans don't really believe there's any contradiction between piety, this sort of holiness, and the pursuit of profits, the pursuit of money. They believe that men of God should be profitable. Because there's no cash crop, because there's no aristocracy or plantation society or this small sort of group that controls the most important commodity, we see a much more equal distribution of wealth in New England than we see in Virginia. So make sure you guys understand the difference between New England and Virginia. The difference in religion, the difference in society, the way society's set up, the difference in family dynamics, and the difference in this sort of aristocracy or also farming differences. So that could be a question on your quiz to compare those two settlements, those two colonies. All right, Roger Williams and Hutchinson, make sure you guys understand those. Pequot. And then make sure you guys understand how the English Civil War impacted American perceptions of freedom, or colonial American perceptions of freedom. Ooh, okay, guys, it's 10:51. Couple of minutes for questions. Any questions on what we just went over?
I do, Professor.
Okay.
I don't know. I missed a lot. I had a VA appointment, so I missed a lot of what you're talking about. Not a VA appointment, but I was talking to VA. So, is there any way that I can retrieve the recorded session to go back and look it over?
Yeah, for sure. All these meetings are recorded and posted on our Blackboard.
Okay.
So check it out. I'll screen share with you guys real quick. So if we go to our class, over here on the left is chapter reviews. And there's last week's on chapter, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in 1302. Chapter reviews, here's last week's on chapter 1. And as soon as this is over, actually around noon today, I'll post chapter 2.
Thank you so much.
No problem. All right, guys. Well, thanks for showing up. Keep in mind, I'm available. If you guys have any specific questions or you guys want to set up an individual meeting, we can work it out. So shoot me an email. All right. Thanks very much, guys. Have a good day. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks, y'all.